April 18, 1942. Japanese Naval Headquarters, Tokyo. Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Inao stood before a wall-sized map of the Pacific Ocean, studying it with the measured confidence of a professional officer who had witnessed his nation's Navy achieve victories that conventional military wisdom said should have been impossible. In the 14 months since the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese combined fleet had swept across nearly half the Pacific, conquering territories from the Gilbert Islands to the Philippines to the coast of Australia. The Americans, who the Japanese High Command had presumed would collapse within months under the psychological shock of that December morning attack, were still fighting, still building, still daring to imagine they could maintain naval dominance across an ocean that seemed to belong entirely to Japan. Yet from the maps on the table, from the intelligence reports being carefully filed away in secure cabinets, the mathematics of American capacity were being analyzed with a mixture of respect and cold calculation. American industrial capacity was impressive. Yes, this everyone agreed. The conflict had already demonstrated that American naval construction, accelerating beyond pre-war forecasts, represented a serious commitment to naval warfare. But could it match the tempo of modern industrial warfare, conducted by a nation that had moved first, that had prepared for years, that had understood from 1937 onward that this war would be won in the first year or not at all? That was the question consuming Japanese strategic planners. Inao ran his finger across the map, identifying the locations where American carriers had been sighted, damaged, and in several triumphant cases, sunk. The Lexington had gone down at the Coral Sea in May 1942. The Yorktown, repaired from the Coral Sea damage, had been sunk at Midway in June. The Hornet had been sunk at Santa Cruz in October. The mathematics seemed to favor Japan in spring 1942. Yes, the Americans were building new carriers, the new Yorktown class and other designs, but intelligence reports suggested these vessels would take a minimum of 2 to 3 years to complete under normal wartime construction schedules. By that time, the war would have concluded. Japan would have negotiated peace from a position of overwhelming strength, or if negotiation failed, would have so thoroughly conquered Southeast Asia and the Pacific that America could never accumulate the resources necessary for a counterinvasion of fortified island strongholds. This was the dominant belief. Commander Minoru Genda, the brilliant tactical officer who had planned and executed the Pearl Harbor attack with such precision that morning 9 months earlier, sat at the table studying reconnaissance reports from American shipyards with mounting concern. He had been arguing, sometimes uncomfortably with fellow officers who preferred to dismiss his warnings, that American industrial potential represented the true long-term threat to the empire. But even Genda believed the timeline favored Japan. American shipyards were building the new Essex-Class carriers. Yes, this much was confirmed by multiple intelligence sources. These vessels represented advanced designs, incorporating lessons learned from earlier Pacific battles, the Coral Sea, Midway, and Santa Cruz. But the earliest intelligence estimates suggested the lead ship would not commission until late 1942 at the earliest, probably not until 1943. If Japan could consolidate positions across the Pacific, establish defensive perimeters on fortified islands, and eliminate the American carrier force before the new Essex carriers became operationally available, Japan could win through attrition and force American peace negotiations from desperation rather than strength. This was the fundamental belief that governed strategy. Everything depended on moving fast, consolidating gains, and then sitting in secure defensive positions until exhaustion forced America to the negotiating table in 1943 or 1944. The American people, so the Japanese High Command believed based on intelligence reports and Foreign Service observations, might lose the will to fight a prolonged war if presented with a series of convincing military defeats. Japanese strategists believed American public opinion, was more fragile than Japanese Bushido code and samurai spirit that bound the nation together in unity. What none of them knew, not Inao, not Genda, not even the strategic thinkers in the Navy Ministry who possessed the most accurate intelligence available, was that they were miscalculating by factors they could not fathom, could not even conceive of, given the limitations of their own industrial system. The Essex-class carriers were not merely coming. They were coming in numbers that would make Japanese intelligence analysts initially dismiss the reports as impossible fabrications, propaganda designed to demoralize Japanese forces. They would come not over 3 or 4 years as conventional wisdom suggested, but with accelerating speed through 1943, through 1944, and into 1945. And by the time Japanese naval officers fully grasped the reality of what was happening in American shipyards, the mathematics of the war had transformed completely from potentially favorable to absolutely, irrevocably catastrophic. The roots of the Essex-class design stretch back to the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922, a document that had constrained naval architects on both sides of the Pacific for 15 years. The treaty, which Japan had rejected in 1937 in pursuit of its own strategic interests, had limited American aircraft carriers to specific tonnage and imposed restrictions that shaped carrier design philosophy throughout the 1930s. The Lexington-class and Yorktown-class carriers, while formidable and impressive in their day, had been designed within treaty constraints that limited displacement to approximately 20,000 to 25,000 tons. This size limitation forced American designers to make difficult trade-offs, sacrificing some armor protection for the speed and aircraft capacity that American naval doctrine emphasized. When Japan rejected the treaty framework and began constructing larger carriers without treaty limitations, the United States Navy found itself facing opponents like the Shikaku-class, powerful ships displacing nearly 32,000 tons, and capable of operating large air groups with enhanced armor protection. American naval architects recognized that if the United States was to remain competitive in carrier warfare, it needed a new design that incorporated lessons learned from 5 years of treaty-bound production, combined with the freedom to grow beyond treaty limitations. The naval establishment began conceptualizing what a post-treaty, true American fleet carrier should look like, integrating all the lessons from combat and peacetime analysis. The Essex-class design, initiated in 1939 and refined through 1940 and early 1941, represented American naval architects' response to this strategic challenge. The ship that would emerge displaced 27,100 tons in standard configuration, roughly equivalent to Shikaku-class vessels in size but with different design priorities. Where Japanese carriers like Shikaku emphasized armor protection and damage control philosophy inherited from battleship design traditions, Essex-class designers prioritized speed, aircraft carrying capacity, and operational resilience through system redundancy rather than through thick armor alone. The Essex-class design was 872 feet long, with a beam of 148 feet, powered by 4 Westinghouse-geared steam turbines producing 150,000 shaft horsepower. This power plant drove the ship at sustained speeds exceeding 33 knots, making Essex-class carriers among the fastest capital ships ever built. 4 boilers fed steam to the turbines through advanced systems that offered both redundancy and efficiency. If one boiler was damaged or destroyed, 3 others could continue functioning, allowing the ship to continue steaming at reduced speed while maintaining offensive capability. If 2 boilers were knocked out, the ship could still operate at a reasonable fraction of full power. This redundancy would prove crucial in wartime operations. The flight deck measured 870 feet in length and 109 feet in beam, providing ample space for aircraft operations. 3 aircraft elevators, including the innovative deck-edge elevator design first introduced on USS Wasp, allowed rapid movement of aircraft between the flight deck and hangars. This design feature cleared the hangar deck of obstructions and improved the flow of aircraft movements, significantly increasing operational tempo. Two catapults, one on the flight deck and one in the hangar, could launch heavy aircraft that otherwise would be unable to achieve takeoff velocity from the confined deck space. The ship could carry between 90 and 100 aircraft depending on aircraft types and weight configurations, a substantial air group by any standard and far exceeding what earlier American carriers could accommodate. Anti-aircraft armament reflected lessons learned from the Coral Sea, Midway, and Santa Cruz, where American carriers had suffered from inadequate close-in anti-aircraft defense. The Essex-Class design incorporated 4 dual-purpose 5-inch 38 caliber gun mounts, plus 4 single 5-inch 38 caliber guns. 8 40mm quad Bofors mounts provided medium-range anti-aircraft defense with rapid rate of fire. 46 20mm Oerlikon guns in single mounts offered close-in defense against torpedo bombers and dive bombers pressing attacks home. This layered defense philosophy meant that an attacking aircraft had to penetrate multiple defensive zones, each one more dense and effective than the last, before it could strike the ship itself. Equally important was the armor scheme. Essex-class carriers incorporated a 2.5-inch to 4-inch armor belt along the hull waterline, protecting the ship from anti-ship projectiles and fragmentation. The hangar deck was protected by 1.5-inch armor plating. Protective decks above the main deck and internal structure incorporated special treatment steel that provided additional protection against both fragmentation and direct bomb hits. The pilot house was enclosed in 4-inch bulkheads of armor steel. Collectively, these protective features would prove their worth repeatedly during the Pacific War, when Essex-class carriers absorbed damage that would have crippled or sunk less well-protected vessels. What distinguished the Essex-class design from all predecessors was not any single feature, but rather the integration of multiple improvements into a standardized design that could be mass-produced at industrial scale. American shipyards had become expert at mass production in civilian industry, particularly automobile manufacturing. The challenge was applying those same principles to warship construction, which had traditionally been treated as a craft industry, where each vessel received individual attention and custom modifications appropriate to that specific ship. Navy officials understood that adapting assembly line principles to carrier construction could revolutionize warship production. The Essex-class design incorporated standardization that would have horrified traditional naval architects trained in the pre-industrial craft tradition. Components were designed to be fabricated by suppliers who did not specialize in naval construction. Sections of the ship could be built simultaneously in different locations, then transported to the assembly shipyard for integration. Power systems, weapons mounts, radar installations, ammunition handling systems, and deck equipment could all be installed using standardized procedures that required less skilled labor than traditional naval construction. This represented a fundamental revolution in how warships were built. The USS Essex, CV-9, the lead ship of her class, was laid down on April 28, 1941 at Newport News Shipbuilding and Drydock Company in Newport News, Virginia. This date itself was significant for what followed. Conventional naval wisdom suggested that a ship of Essex's complexity and size would require a minimum of 3 to 4 years to construct from keel laying to commissioning. Peacetime construction had taken significantly longer for similarly complex vessels. The crew that would build Essex worked in a facility that had been modernized in preparation for precisely this task. Newport News had built carriers before, including USS Yorktown, CV-5, and would build multiple Essex-class carriers during the war. The yard had developed expertise in large warship construction and possessed the infrastructure to handle a ship of Essex's size. But the American entry into World War II in December 1940, triggered a transformation in construction priorities and procedures. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet after the Pearl Harbor attack, understood with crystalline clarity that American carrier production would determine the outcome of the war in the Pacific. Every week of delay in completing new carriers represented additional risk. Japanese carriers would remain in the fleet, threatening American operations. American naval forces would be limited in their offensive capability. The pressure to accelerate Essex's construction became not merely a desire, but a military imperative that drove every decision. By mid-1942, the pressure was producing results that surprised even optimistic planners. The Essex began to take shape with remarkable speed. Steel sections fabricated according to standardized plans were welded into place. Standardized compartments began taking form within the growing hull. The prefabrication approach, borrowed from American industrial experience with ships and large structures, allowed work to progress on multiple sections simultaneously rather than sequentially, as would have been the case in traditional shipyards. On July 31, 1942, after just over a year in construction, Essex was launched. The ceremony, attended by military officials and naval architects, marked a moment of significance in American military history. Here was a major warship, displacing 36,000 tons at full load, incorporating the latest advances in naval technology, complex weapons systems, sophisticated power plants and defense mechanisms, completed from keel laying to launch in just over a year. By traditional naval standards, this was impossible, yet it had happened. The Essex was not immediately combat-ready upon launch. Launching merely meant the hull was seaworthy and could float. Significant work remained installing weapons, radar systems, machinery testing, and crew training. But the launch date itself marked a turning point in American industrial philosophy. A ship that would have required 4 years to build under peacetime standards had been completed in 14 months. The implication was shocking to traditional naval architects and strategists on both sides of the Pacific. Essex completed her trials in December 1942 and was commissioned on December 31, 1942, under the command of Captain Donald B. Duncan. She was operationally available for deployment to the Pacific in May 1943, representing only a 10-month interval from launch to combat readiness. For a warship of this complexity, this timeline was almost impossible to comprehend by naval officers trained in traditional shipyard practices. Admiral Ozawa, still evaluating Essex-Class construction progress through intelligence channels in the summer of 1942, received reports that the lead Essex-Class carrier was launched in July. The Japanese Naval Officer Corps took notice. One ship, built faster than expected, this represented a challenge but not a catastrophe. But one ship did not represent a fundamental transformation in American capacity. Essex would need months for final fitting out, trials, and crew training before becoming combat-ready. The usual timeline, even for an accelerated schedule, suggested Essex would not become operationally available until late 1942 or early 1943. What Japanese intelligence failed to anticipate was the degree to which American industry was willing to compress the fitting-out period, and how effectively American practices had streamlined the process. The efficiency was unprecedented in naval history. The second Essex-class carrier, USS Lexington, CV-16, was launched on September 23, 1942, just 2 months after the first ship. The spacing between launches was shrinking with each new ship, as yards learned the Essex-class construction procedures more efficiently. Lexington commissioned on February 17, 1943, having completed fitting out and trials in roughly the same timeframe as Essex. USS Yorktown, CV-10, launched on January 21, 1943, and commissioned on April 15, 1943. 2 carriers had entered service, and the third was following closely. By the time Essex and Lexington were deployed to the Pacific, follow-on ships were completing their own construction cycles. USS Bunker Hill, CV-17, commissioned on May 25, 1943. USS Intrepid CV-11, commissioned on August 16, 1943. USS Wasp CV-18, commissioned on November 24, 1943. USS Hornet CV-12, commissioned on November 29, 1943. 6 Essex-Class carriers by year-end 1943. The production rate was accelerating rather than slowing down. From the perspective of American naval planners, this acceleration was gratifying. From the perspective of Japanese intelligence officers watching reports of American carrier completions arriving with increasing frequency, it was becoming alarming. By autumn 1943, 6 Essex-Class carriers had been commissioned. A 7th, USS Franklin CV-13, was under construction, and an 8th, USS Hancock CV-19, was taking shape at the yards. Japanese intelligence analysts initially interpreted these reports within their existing framework. American carrier construction was accelerating, yes, but not to impossible levels. Carriers required skilled labor, advanced manufacturing capability, and rare materials. Surely American production, while impressive, could not maintain this pace indefinitely. Perhaps the reports were exaggerated. Surely there had to be a limit to American capacity. Then in January 1944, USS Franklin commissioned. In April, USS Hancock commissioned on April 15, 1944. In May, USS Ticonderoga, CV-14, commissioned on May 8, 1944. The reports continued arriving with methodical regularity, each one documenting a new Essex-Class carrier entering service. By May 1944, 8 Essex-Class carriers had been commissioned, and 8 more were under active construction. By the end of 1944, 12 Essex-Class carriers were in active service. The implications for Japanese naval planning were becoming unavoidable. This was not acceleration. This was transformation. American shipyards were producing Essex-Class carriers faster than Japanese strategic planners had believed possible. Each carrier represented roughly 900 crew members, 100 aircraft, and weapons systems that matched or exceeded Japanese equivalents. 8 Essex-Class carriers represented a concentration of naval power equivalent to the entire Japanese carrier force at the height of its strength in 1942. But Japan was not adding carriers to its fleet. Japan was losing them. The Shikaku went down on June 19, 1944, torpedoed by USS Kavala during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The Zuikaku was sunk on October 25, 1944, during the Battle of Cape Engano at Leyte Gulf. The Hiyo was sunk on June 20, 1944, after being hit by torpedoes and suffering a catastrophic gasoline vapor explosion. Japan had commissioned the Teiho in March 1944, a powerful fleet carrier with armored flight deck concepts that made it perhaps the most sophisticated carrier Japan had built. Yet on June 19, 1944, it was struck by a single torpedo from USS Albacore. The torpedo hit ruptured aviation fuel tanks and jammed the forward elevator. As damage control crews fought the fire, gasoline vapors accumulated in the hangar deck. Hours later, a spark ignited the accumulated fumes in a massive explosion. Teiho sank that afternoon with over 1,300 men. Japan was building carriers, yes, but the Unryu class and other new designs were entering service slowly, consumed resources far in excess of Essex-class construction requirements, and often failed to achieve the combat effectiveness that emerged quickly from American crews operating American ships. By October 1944, the psychological and strategic implications for Japanese naval officers had become impossible to deny. Admiral Mainichi Koga, commanding Japanese naval forces before his death in March 1944, had sat in the headquarters of the combined fleet and confronted a mathematics that had become implacable and obvious. Every 6 weeks, like clockwork, a new American task force formed around Essex-class carriers would appear somewhere in the Pacific execute devastating strikes against Japanese positions with precision, then withdraw before effective Japanese response could be mounted. The carrier force that appeared at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 included Essex, Lexington, Yorktown, Bunker Hill, Wasp, Hornet, and Intrepid, plus the pre-war Enterprise and lighter carriers. 7 fleet carriers, each one capable of launching 100 or more aircraft, concentrated their firepower with coordination that Japanese intelligence services could track but could not counter. Admiral Ozawa, commanding Japanese carrier forces at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, recalled the moment when the scale of American production had become undeniable. "We detected a new Essex-Class carrier force assembling in American bases approximately every 6 weeks," he testified. This was confirmed through multiple intelligence sources. Each carrier represented the industrial output of weeks of American shipyard labor. We could not replace losses at a fraction of this rate. The Japanese military production system, despite being mobilized for total war, could not compete with American capacity. Japan built approximately 25 major fleet carriers across the entire war. America built 24 Essex-class carriers alone, plus the Independence-class light carriers, plus escort carriers, plus the Midway class that entered service late in the war. The numerical disparity was catastrophic. The strategic shock for Japanese leadership became more acute as 1944 advanced. The final counting of Essex-class carriers commissioned produced numbers that exceeded even the most pessimistic projections made by Japanese strategic planners. By the end of 1944, 12 Essex-class carriers were operational. By May 1945, that number had grown to 17, with additional ships still under construction or preparing for commissioning. The commissioning timeline demonstrated the accelerating production rate. USS Essex CV-9, December 31, 1942. USS Lexington CV-16, February 17, 1943. USS Yorktown CV-10, April 15, 1943. USS Bunker Hill CV-17, May 25, 1943. USS Intrepid CV-11, August 16, 1943. USS Wasp CV-18, November 24, 1943. USS Hornet CV-12, November 29, 1943. USS Franklin CV-13, January 31, 1944. USS Hancock CV-19, April 15, 1944. USS Ticonderoga CV-14, May 8, 1944. USS Bennington CV-20, August 6, 1944. USS Randolph CV-15, October 9, 1944. Plus 6 additional Essex-class carriers commissioned by war's end in 1945. The sustained production rate of 3 to 4 carriers per year, maintained year after year without interruption, contradicted everything Japanese planners had believed about the limits of American industrial capacity. The physical plants required to produce this number of ships were themselves remarkable. Newport News Shipbuilding in Virginia, which had constructed multiple Essex-class carriers, had been expanded to operate at full wartime capacity. Bethlehem Steel Corporation's Four River Shipyard in Quincy, Massachusetts, contributed multiple Essex-class carriers to the fleet. The geographic distribution meant that Essex-class production spread economic benefits and manufacturing capacity across multiple regions of America, reinforcing sustainability. Each shipyard operated with a permanent workforce trained extensively in Essex-class construction procedures. The repetition of the same design meant that workers became expert in their tasks. The second Essex-class carrier took less time to construct than the first. The third took less time than the second. By the 10th or 12th ship, the yards had optimized the process sufficiently that new ships could be completed at planned rates or better. Japanese planners confronted a fundamental reality about American industrial organization. American shipyards had applied the principles of mass production successful in automobile manufacturing to warship construction. Standardized components, prefabrication, parallel construction processes, and worker specialization had transformed carrier construction from a craft industry into an industrial process. The results were standardized products rolling off production lines in accordance with carefully planned schedules, not uniquely individual creations requiring master shipwrights. More disturbing to Japanese naval planners than mere numbers was the quality of systems installed on Essex-Class carriers. The radar systems represented technology that Japan either lacked entirely or possessed only in limited quantities. The SK-2 air search radar could detect aircraft at ranges exceeding 100 miles. The SC-2 air search radar provided complementary capability at different frequencies. These radar systems allowed Essex-class carrier task forces to direct their defense and coordinate with other units in ways Japanese carriers could not match. When American radar detected incoming Japanese aircraft, fighter direction officers aboard Essex-class carriers could vector Hellcat interceptors directly onto incoming formations with precision. Japanese pilots flying toward targets they could not see would suddenly encounter American fighters positioned at altitude and distance enough to initiate attacks before pilots were even aware of the threat. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat, beginning to reach the Pacific Fleet in numbers during 1943-1944, was specifically designed to counter the Zero fighter. The Hellcat did not attempt to turn with the Zero or match its maneuverability. Instead, the Hellcat was faster in level flight, faster in the dive, and capable of operating at higher altitudes. American tactical doctrine emphasized using these advantages. Attack from altitude advantage. Press attacks from positions the enemy cannot reach. Use speed and superior firepower to destroy the enemy and escape. The intersection of material superiority and operational experience created cascading advantages for American forces. American carrier pilots reaching the Pacific in 1940, 31944 arrived with standardized training emphasizing fighter direction, formation flying, anti-ship tactics, and radar-directed combat procedures. These pilots had practiced these procedures repeatedly. They had studied gun camera film from previous engagements. They were prepared mentally and procedurally for operations they would conduct. Japanese carrier pilots in 1944, increasingly comprising replacement pilots trained in the Japanese system, arrived with individual flying skills, sometimes excellent but inadequate for modern carrier air operations. A pilot might execute complex aerial maneuvers with precision, but lack procedural knowledge to integrate with other aircraft in coordinated operations or operate effectively within constraints of radar-directed combat. The Japanese training system emphasized individual skill over team coordination. The Battle of the Philippine Sea demonstrated this disparity devastatingly. The battle is often called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. American radar-directed fighters encountered incoming Japanese aircraft formations and achieved kill ratios of 10-to-1 or higher. Over the 2 days of June 1920, 1944, approximately 600 Japanese aircraft were destroyed against fewer than 100 American aircraft losses. American pilots had trained for this exact scenario. Japanese pilots were experiencing it for the first time and had no doctrine for defending against such coordinated opposition. Of approximately 430 Japanese aircraft launched across both days, only 35 survived. To understand the Essex-class carrier program fully is to understand that these ships were not merely naval weapons. They were physical manifestations of American industrial capacity applied to global war on unprecedented scale. The same industrial system that produced Essex-class carriers also produced 2,710 Liberty ships, over 125,000 military trucks, tens of thousands of military aircraft of various types, and ammunition in virtually unlimited quantities. By 1944, American industrial production had reached dimensions that contemporary observers could barely comprehend. American steel production exceeded 80 million tons annually. American shipyards could produce merchant vessels at rates that would not be approached again until containerization transformed commercial shipping in the 1960s. American aircraft factories were producing combat aircraft at rates that caused German and Japanese intelligence services to conclude reports were exaggerated propaganda. The Essex-Class carrier program represented the apex of this industrial pyramid. Here was a 36,000-ton warship of extreme complexity, equipped with sophisticated weapon systems, radar installations, damage control features, and accommodation for 2,600 sailors and 100 aircraft. The ship required precision manufacturing in hundreds of components that had to fit together within tight tolerances. Yet American yards were producing them at a rate of 3 to 4 per year, each one operational within months of commissioning. Japanese industrial capacity, measured against American capacity, was increasingly inadequate. Japan had to import raw materials from Southeast Asia and Manchuria. As American submarines degraded Japanese maritime commerce, these imports dried up. Japanese shipyards, operating with constrained resources, reduced labor forces as available men were drafted into military service, and competing demands for limited steel and engineering capacity could not sustain rapid carrier production. As the war progressed into 1945, Japanese military leadership, confronting mathematical certainty of eventual defeat, adopted increasingly desperate tactics. Kamikaze suicide aircraft attacks, launched with growing frequency, represented the most visible manifestation of desperation. Young Japanese pilots, many barely trained, were sent against American ships with knowledge they would not return. The Essex-class carriers, by virtue of their size and presence in forward operations, became prime targets for these attacks. USS Bunker Hill was struck by 2 kamikazes on May 11, 1945, and suffered devastating fires. USS Franklin was struck on March 19, 1945, and suffered damage so severe that only American damage control procedures, redundant systems built into the Essex design, and extraordinary skill of damage control parties prevented loss. USS Ticonderoga was struck by a kamikaze on January 21, 1945, and suffered serious damage. What was remarkable was that despite severity of damage inflicted by kamikaze attacks, Essex-class carriers demonstrated survivability that shocked Japanese observers. A ship like USS Franklin, with 807 men killed and 487 wounded, should have sunk. Yet through extraordinary damage control procedures, American sailors managed to restore USS Franklin to limited operating capability. The ship eventually returned to the United States for repairs and would have returned to service if the war had continued. This resilience derived from protective features designed into the Essex hull, redundancy built into systems, and superior damage control training that American naval personnel received. Japanese carriers, even those with superior armor protection, lacked the redundancy in systems that would allow continued operation after serious damage. By autumn 1944, Japanese naval leadership had accepted the mathematical reality that the war could not be won through conventional means. Operation Shogo, the plan to fight the decisive fleet battle that would destroy American carrier forces, ended in disaster at the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Japanese battleships, the last hope for inflicting decisive damage on American forces, were sunk by air attacks from Essex-class carriers. Japanese carriers, already depleted from Philippine sea losses, were used as decoys in a desperate gambit to draw American attention while battleships attempted to attack American transport ships. The gambit failed. By 1945, Japanese naval power had ceased to exist as an organized force capable of challenging American operations. Japanese submarines attempting to sink American carriers occasionally succeeded in inflicting damage, but could not reduce American carrier strength faster than American shipyards replaced losses. The few Japanese aircraft that could contest American air superiority over the home islands were increasingly ineffective against American Hellcats, operated by pilots with superior training and experience. The Essex-Class carriers, operating in groups, demonstrated a concentration of naval power unprecedented in history. A single task group built around 3 or 4 Essex-Class carriers, plus light carriers, cruisers, and destroyers, could generate sufficient aircraft to overwhelm any conceivable Japanese defense. American pilots, now dominant in every tactical air engagement, could shoot down Japanese aircraft at ratios that were simply catastrophic. The Essex-Class carrier program proved several lessons that would shape military and industrial policy for decades. First, industrial capacity, when properly mobilized, could be transformed at remarkable speed. American shipyards had built 24 Essex-Class carriers in 36 months, plus dozens of supporting light carriers, plus hundreds of other naval vessels, plus tens of thousands of merchant ships. Second, standardization and mass production could be applied to complex military equipment without sacrificing quality. Each Essex-Class carrier was a sophisticated warship of extreme complexity. Yet by adhering to standardized designs, prefabricating components, and organizing labor into specialized tasks, American yards had produced these ships faster than traditional shipyards could build smaller, simpler vessels. Third, operational integration and training could transform material advantages into decisive results. American carrier forces had superior ships, superior aircraft, superior radar, superior pilot training, and superior damage control procedures. These advantages, when combined into an integrated operational system, produced overwhelming superiority. Japanese forces that possessed inferior equipment, inferior training, or inferior procedures in any single dimension found that combination of deficiencies added up to complete defeat. Fourth, the war demonstrated that in modern industrial warfare, production capacity equals military power. Japan had proven that discipline, courage, and tactical brilliance could achieve victories even against materially superior opponents. Yet sustained victory was impossible when the opponent could replace losses faster than they were inflicted. Over time, material superiority, when backed by adequate industrial capacity and organizational competence, would prove decisive. Japanese naval officers who survived the war reflected on confronting Essex-Class carriers. Admiral Ozawa, in his post-war memoirs, reflected on understanding American industrial capacity. I was shown photographs of American shipyards operating at full capacity in 1944. Rows of carriers under construction, massive numbers of escort vessels being built, merchant ship production exceeding anything we could comprehend. I realized then that Japan had chosen to fight an opponent whose industrial capacity was fundamentally unlimited compared to our own. We did not lose to superior strategy or superior tactics. We lost to mathematics. We fought against an industrial system that could not be defeated through military means. The story of how Japanese admirals called the Essex-Class carrier impossible and then watched America launch 24 in 36 months is ultimately a story about the power of industrial capacity, organizational competence, and sustained commitment. It is a story about what modern nations can achieve when they mobilize their full resources toward single objectives. It is a story that echoes through modern history, a reminder that in total wars, the nation that can sustain production and operations over years of conflict will ultimately triumph regardless of tactical brilliance or individual acts of courage. The Essex-Class carriers proved that proposition beyond any doubt. They changed the nature of naval warfare, dominated the Pacific War, and set the pattern for naval aviation for decades to come. They were built faster than military experts said was possible. They operated more effectively than their designers had anticipated. They demonstrated American industrial capacity in ways that no other weapons system could match. And they accomplished what military professionals throughout history have sought. They made the impossible real through discipline, organization, and sustained commitment to excellence. When the war ended, Japanese naval officers who had witnessed Essex-class carriers operate alongside pre-war Enterprise and Independence-class carriers knew what they had confronted. It was not merely ships. It was the full weight of American industrial democracy, brought to bear with devastating effectiveness in pursuit of victory. Against such an opponent, in such a context, Japan had never possessed the capacity to win. The Essex-class carriers were the physical manifestation of that reality made steel, and they carried that message through every engagement until the day Japan surrendered. In the end, the Japanese admirals were right about one thing. The Essex-class carriers were impossible to defeat, to replace, to overcome. They represented an industrial and organizational achievement that Japan could not match. And that reality, more than any other factor, determined the outcome of the Pacific War. 4 Essex-class carriers survive as museum ships today: USS Essex, USS Lexington, USS Yorktown, and USS Intrepid. These magnificent vessels continue to float on American waters, allowing new generations to walk the decks and understand the scope of what American industrial mobilization, strategic vision, and operational excellence achieved during humanity's greatest and most terrible conflict. They stand as monuments to American industrial power and to the ordinary workers who built them with extraordinary dedication to victory.